All right, so my name is Trovarsi, and this is Modulation Sound Lab. And today we have Jim Coker, and we will be discussing the 512 vector sequencer. Jim is the developer of the numerology program. He's the developer of the sequencer, owner of 512, and yeah, he's just amazing sequencer. So we thought it would be great to have him come on here. I know several of you have the vector sequencer, so this is going to be super beneficial for those who have it and also those who are interested in possibly adding it to their system. So Jim, I will let you take it from here.
Okay, I'll switch over to my demo system. And just do a really quick audio check, make sure. We got levels. All right, so this is the vector sequencer. It is a 42 HP Eurorack module. There's also a 12 HP expander that's available. And the reason I have a Launchpad over here is that we've done a detailed mapping to use the Launchpad to control the vector sequencer. I'll get to that a little bit later. The vector is a digital sequencer with an analog style control format. There are two large OLED displays with encoders beneath for editing parameters like this. There's also an encoder to the left that allows you to edit several parameters at once. Sometimes some of them, sometimes all. Sometimes it's also used for navigation. There are MIDI and analog inputs and outputs available. There are two voice outputs available on the main unit and then four more on the expander. Each voice output has a pitch, a gate, and a velocity output. And then additionally on the expander, there are 8 trigger outputs, 4 of which can also be inputs. There are two 3.5 millimeter MIDI connectors with adapters on board, as well as both forms of USB MIDI. On the expander, we have DIN MIDI in and out, and we also have DIN sync in and out. Finally, we have two modulation inputs on the vector, and what these control can be determined per part. And there are 8 parts on the vector. There are also run, clock, and reset inputs and outputs. So these are bidirectional also for sync. As I just mentioned, there are 8 parts. Each part has its own main sequence, and there are also several chance operations and modulations available, but it's certainly the sort of sequence where you can build a complete song in. In fact, we also have presets. So on a part with 16 steps, we have up to 20 presets available. And we also have a scene mode that allows you to do Ableton style scene setups and triggers. So this is a good way to do a live arrangement. Steps are nominally 16 steps long. You can see 8 at a time. You can also reformat a part to be 32 or 64 steps. We have monophonic parts as the default, but also you can set up a chord part. I have a chord part set up on part 5, and you can set up drum parts. I have a drum part set up on part 8. Chord and drum parts have 4 voices each, and it's fairly easy to set up, say, 8 lanes of drums across 2 different parts. I could do 7 and 8 for drums. So for editing, let me go back to part 1. I'm going to start the sequence. And the first thing I want to do is turn some notes on. I can do this by pushing encoders. You can mute and unmute by pushing the encoders. I can also go to the gate page. All the edit buttons just along the top of the OLED. And I can edit values here. I can also use encoder number 9 to edit them all together. So I can turn them all off and then turn them all on and then go back and dial in a few to be longer. I can also do tied steps. See, so you have a held note or a legato note. On the pitch page, of course, we can edit pitches. We can also set up a glide. I can hold down the shift key and I can edit individual steps by octaves. I can also hold the Shift key and use encoder 9 to switch the whole sequence up and down by octaves. Below the 8 encoders, we have a 1-octave mini keyboard. When you're in one of the edit modes, the white keys can be used in one of 3 different modes: skip, mute, or select. In skip mode, the white keys skip steps, which basically removes them from the sequence. I can use Shift Skip to remove all skipped values. And switch over to the mute sub mode, and this mutes the steps without removing it from the sequence. The select mode allows me to select some steps, and then I can use encoder 9 to edit them as a group. Shift select to clear those out. So that's pitch and gate. We have velocity as well. I don't have that mapped for CV, but you can have a CV output mapped to say filter cutoff, or of course with MIDI it becomes MIDI velocity. We have step length and repeat. So if I'm working in any of the edit pages and I want to normalize everything back to what it was before, I can hold the Shift key and press the edit button that's active. And that removes those changes. Of course, we have ratchets. I can ratchet a few, I can ratchet several. Chance operations I'll come back to in a minute. Ditto for modulation. On the control page, we have 8 parameters on the main page that control kind of the global settings for the sequence. So the length of the sequence, where it starts within the range of steps that are available, the direction, of course, forwards, backwards, alternating modes, and random. Whether reset is automatic in the end of the sequence, or if, say, it's at a certain beat. So if I'm using an unusual number of step lengths, I can force the sequence to reset every 4 beats, or every 8, or so forth. Sequence rate and the rate mode. By default, we use musical division rate modes. The rate modes, so 16/16 triplets going down to dotted 16th, 8th notes, and so forth. And then I won't go into a lot of detail right now, but the rate modes include a lot of modes that can be completely off-grid, or at least off a normal musical grid. Percentage of a beat, speed mode, where higher numbers are faster. Some crossfade and phase modes that are good for setting up patterns against each other that slowly phase in and out at a time. There are actually 6 of these available. Then there are fractional modes, which are another interesting grid to work with. And then also there are some external trigger modes, and I'll do that in a demo later today. So we'll go back to musical divisions. Octave transpose, you can set here for the whole sequence, and semitone transpose. Also on this page, you can use the mini keyboard as live transposition. You can transpose up just by hitting any of the keys on the mini keyboard. You can also use the previous and next buttons to go, say, down an octave or up 2 octaves. So that's the kind of like what we call primary editing. Chance operations, I can select from one of several different operations. We'll say ratchet is usually good for a beginning demo, so I'll dial up a ratchet on a couple of these. I'll set the operation. I'll set a probability. I'll set it fairly high. I can pull the probability down a little bit. I could also say, select a few steps and choose skips. Clear out that selection. I could also pick some other steps, and I can choose a pitch operation. We'll say pitch up an octave. So now I've got a whole set of operations that every time it's only an 8-step sequence, but every time it plays through, it'll sound a little different. On the modulation pages, I can set up a subsequencer. So each main sequencer, which is the one generating all these notes, has 2 subsequencers also available. They're semi-independent. I could set a length, and they can be used to modulate the main sequence. So I can set a length, a direction. I'm going to use whole notes, and I'm going to modulate transpose, turn that on. And I'll set up a very simple chordal type transposition going down 5 semitones and then 7 semitones. And then I can have this running, or I can turn this on and off with just that switch. Let's see, something else to mention is that all the inputs and outputs are configurable. I can go into the routing page, and for example, I have pitch outputs, pitch, gate, and velocity outputs for parts on numbered 3 and 4 on the expander are set to part 5. So pitch 3, gate 3, velocity 3, pitch 4, gate 4, velocity 4, which are these jacks here, are actually outputting part 5, which I've set up as a chord part. And pitch 3 gets part 5 voice 1, pitch 4 gets part 5 voice 2, and I'll show an example a little later using a chord sequence to actually sequence a monosynth with 2 oscillators, which is an AJH that's just off the screen here. So all the inputs and outputs are fairly configurable. If you're outputting MIDI, go to the MIDI page. MIDI out 1, I'm sending 2 parts out. This is left over some work I was doing earlier. So this MIDI cable here is going over to polysynth that I have plugged in for pads and things. And then MIDI out 2 is part 8, which I'm using for drums. I have that going to the Bitbox Micro. And if you happen to have Bitbox equipment, you can use a standard 3.5 millimeter TRS cable. You don't need the adapter because we use the same cable format as they do. So that covers most of the basics. Trovarsi, any particular questions, things I missed?
I don't have any questions. Maybe just to reiterate that the modulation on the submodulation lanes, if people notice that by him changing the rate, it's on a completely different sequence. So it did show that. Just to point that out, because I know when I first got it, I was like,
what?
When I first got the Vector, I was, like, that was one of the things I was trying to figure out. I remember that being new, using it, and just trying to understand the sub modulation.
Sorry about that. I'm just reaching over to grab a manual because Vector comes with a nice full color printed manual with, for example, on the chance operations side, it details what all the chance operations are, but also on the back page is a diagram that shows how things are organized. So the project has everything, and then there are 8 parts. Each part has up to 20 presets. And then in a preset, you've got your main note sequencer, you've got the 2 subsequencers, which are semi-independent, and you have an external modulation settings. And then you also have your presets. So these are the presets. The preset playlist is a set of instructions on the presets. We can talk about that a little later. And then the scenes, which I showed briefly, is a way to, do a large scale arrangement across all the parts.
Very cool.
And then I guess
like that you can change the colors.
Yes. When you are, so in the global settings, there are 3 main sections. So you have your general preferences, and there are a few pages of these. And then you have the part settings, and you can go in and say part 1, the foreground is, in this case, magenta, but it could be yellow or even off. background color as well. Also, this is where you set the format for the sequence. So it's 16 steps. It could be 32 or 64. It could be monophonic. Actually, I have to go to part. The last 4 parts can be reformatted. So part 5 is 16-step chords. Part 6 is 16-step chords. And 7 and 8. 7 is still mono. I haven't done anything with that. I could reformat that as drums. Hold down the Shift key and press clear to execute that, reformat that part. And if I look at, so now part 7 is drums. Part 8 I've already formatted as drums. To switch between parts, you can push the part button to go to part page. This gives you an overview of everything that's happening. Your indicator lights. Part 5 I have muted and part 8 I have muted, but I can unmute the drums, for example, or part 5 is a sort of a bass line. There are lots of little shortcuts. We try and add these in to make it easier to use, but they aren't required. So one little trick is you can hold the part button, select another part, and then just release it, and you're there. You don't have to, push part, go, and then go back to where you're going. You can just go direct. Another shortcut is actually there's a whole series of operations along the white keys. So I'm going to start by making a copy of this pattern, and I'm going to go through these just kind of in somewhat random order. I'm going to clear out the pattern, hold Shift, and press the rightmost white button to clear out the pattern. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a 4-step pattern. And now I'm going to hold Shift and press the first white key, which is double, which doubles the sequence and sets it twice as long. So this is an interesting way to build up a pattern. You can even clear that out. 2 steps, if you're really at a loss for what to do, double that out, and then just start. It's an interesting way to create a self-similarity in your pattern without having to really think about it too much. You can just explore. I can also do pitch inversion on the pattern. Another easy way to get a variation. We have pattern generators, so I can hold Shift and press the 3rd white key, and just keep pressing until I find something I like. Under the control page, sequence control, I can dial encoder 9 down to page 3 of sort of sequence level settings, preferences, and I can set the generator pattern. There are several that are kind of acid based, Berlin School, and then some more abstract patterns. But just for playing around with basic 8-step sequencers, the Berlin School variations are good. Evolve is a way to take a pattern. Actually, I'm going to simplify this pattern a lot so we can hear how evolve works. Hold down the Shift key, press the 4th white button, and it just makes subtle changes. It basically swaps pitch values and sometimes changes pitch values. The next 2 options, Shift left and right. Shift the whole sequence left or right, which is particularly useful if, say, you've written out a good groove, but somehow it's kind of out of phase with your drums. This is one way to bring it back in time. Mutes the part. You can bring that back easily. So those are those shortcuts. And another one I used, hold down Shift, press preset, and that will make a snapshot, a new copy of whatever you're working on. On the preset page, I can go back and select different presets that I have working. If I have 2 that I like, those 2 are about the same. Let's find one that's a little different than this. I'm just going to go in, just transpose that down completely. I'm going to set up a short playlist to combine these 2. So I'm on part 5. In the preset page, I hit previous. look for part 5. I'm going to say play for 2 bars and then go to part 6. Sorry, preset 6. Preset 6, play for 2 bars and then go to preset 5 and then repeat that forever. And then I go into globals on my primary settings page with tempo and so forth. Turn on the playlist and start the transport. So now I've got a simple playlist that flips between these 2 presets. So it's a nice handy little arrangement trick. And I've also used this if, say, you're working with a set of presets that are formatted as 16-step sequences, and you find, oh, I really need 32 steps for a certain pattern. You can set it up here on the preset page, play a pattern for 1 bar, or you can say a certain number of beats. In this case, 1 bar will be fine. And preset 6, play for 1 bar, go back to preset 5. So now basically these 2 presets are tied together as a 32-step sequence. Let me turn the playlist off for the rest of the demo.
Jim, there's a question of I'm going to interject just because I think it ties into what you've been doing so far.
Sure.
So just for Christian Muller, do these operations apply to the entire pattern if longer than 8 steps, or specifically the steps I currently see?
On the preset page for setting up the playlist.
No, sorry, it was before for like the inversion and the evolve.
The generator.
Yeah.
Like so this is an interesting question because originally it was only the steps that are actually playing. So this is an 8-step sequence and there are another 16 steps here. So I'm only playing 8, but there are 16 steps here that aren't playing. And originally I had the generate, the evolve, only affect the steps that are visible, that are actually playing. And then I started getting requests. It's like, well, I like to do what I call windowing, where you have a shorter sequence and at different times you move the start step to window through the sequence. So I started changing those algorithms to operate on all the steps. Double only happens, of course, on the steps that are playing. Otherwise, you couldn't double the length of the sequence. And then shift left and right only works on the ones that are visible. I'm sorry, the ones that are playing.
Right, makes sense. Cool.
Yeah. But I mean, that's one of those things. It's like I'm always trying to solicit feedback on what people are doing and how it works. And I added an arpeggiator recently, and I had an interesting conflict between 2 folks I know well who use the vector a lot, and one wanted arpeggios to be completely separate from the rest of their patterns, and one wanted to use arpeggios in line to build patterns. So I kind of chewed on it for a couple of days and decided, okay, we'll have 2 arpeggio modes, which I guess I should show now. So I'm going to go to part 4, and I'm going to erase this part. On the record page, which we haven't really talked about yet, there's a master record on off. There's a record mode and a source. There's several different modes in here. There's one for step record with playing the note, which I call step plus through, transpose. So you can transpose a sequence from this keyboard or some other keyboard, through. So you can just play. So let's say, so I can actually play a melody on the vector keyboard, which is a little constrained, but useful now and then. Real-time grid, and now the arpeggio mode. So we have an inline arpeggio version and a preset bass. So I'll show the inline version first, and I'm going to just conveniently jump over to the Launchpad and choose USB-A as the input, so I can use the Launchpad as a keyboard here. I'm going to set latch off. We'll go for 2 octaves up and down. And I'm going to turn on all the gate steps and start playing a sequence. When I lift the keys, I'm unlatched. So when I lift the keys, We don't hear anything as I hold down keys. You can add and remove notes. If I get to something I like, I can turn latch on and then release and it'll hold. And you can see that what's happening is it's actually writing the pitches into the sequence as I play them, even repeating it out for the octave repeat, the octave increment and the mode for, in this case, up and down. I can go in here and I can change these settings and it'll rewrite the pattern to match it. And then all the other settings, which is on I can reset, are still available. So I can go in and do that. I can put in a couple repeats. And I still have my arpeggio going. And I still get my step repeats and my ratchets. I can set the rate of the sequence here. The arpeggio changes the length of the sequence and the pitches. Everything else is as you set it. So that's the inline version of the arpeggiator. The preset version, what happens is it jumps to the last preset available and names it ARP. And every time that you turn on the ARP preset mode, it jumps to this preset so it doesn't overwrite what you were doing otherwise. So I can go in here, set up an arpeggio. And then when I'm done with that, I can go back to my other presets. I can still go back to the ARP preset if I want.
So Chris is asking, are the note lengths, mutes, and skips also recognized in arpeggio mode?
Yes, yes. So come back to, let's see, I had inline on 3, I think.
And Jim, just to confirm with the firmware, is the last firmware that you released, is that has the first ARP mode, and then is the second, is the beta still the 2 options of ARPs? Are they now available?
So the official release version is still, I think, 2.06, and it doesn't have the ARP modes. The beta version is a little bit earlier than this one, so I'll make a note to post this one later today. This is 2.1.19, which is the one I was using at KnobCon. And it has both of the updated ARP modes and a few other tricks.
Cool. And then Stu asked, or Ian, sorry, asked, what happens if the amount of keys you hold down in ARP mode combo require more than 16 or more steps?
It writes the first 16 that it can calculate and stops there.
Cool.
Yeah. And then I since I've been using, I should probably talk a little bit about the Launchpad. So I've been doing Launchpad mappings for quite a while now, and for numerology on the desktop. And of course, with the Vector, it made a lot of sense to have it. The idea is that, we have a really nice physical interface for editing patterns based around the metaphor of the display and the encoders. The Launchpad gives us a way to edit things using a grid. It also works fairly well since the Vector has 8 parts and the Launchpad is an 8x8 grid. It works very well as kind of a global overview of your system. And so the mapping for the Launchpad and the Vector is a fair bit different from the one in numerology. On the Vector, we have four main pages. We have a session overview page. We have a presets page, a keyboard, and an editing area. So I'll go through each of those. On the session overview page, the top row of buttons are for selecting the part that you're editing. So if you look at the part name here, if I want to edit part 8 on the vector, I can use that to jump over part 1, part 8. The second row is for record enable. So I had record enable on 3. I can turn that off. The purple one on 1 is the ARP mode. So I can turn that off, and you can see there that goes off back on to ARP mode. The third row are mutes across the parts. So if I unmute my other parts on the mixer, I can still mute them. On the Launchpad, the next 2 rows are mutes per voice. So if I unmute my drums, I can mute individual lanes on the drums using these buttons.
And when editing drums, when editing a drum part on a Launchpad, is there a way to set up the velocity of a step on the Launchpad?
No, I didn't add that because I wanted to keep those pages fairly slim. So, and velocity editing on the vector is fairly straightforward and more detailed. It's actually, that's one thing that the grid doesn't work very well, is when you've got, a range of, I think it's, 120, well, it's probably like 30 options, 30 value levels on the drum sequence page, and trying to squeeze that into 8 vertical steps on the Launchpad gets a little tricky. You can, you start to make compromises of, I could have 64 values for one parameter, or I can have 8 parameters and 8 values and maybe squeeze that up to 16 somehow. It's trade-off. So the idea with the Launchpad mapping is to keep it simple enough that it's easy to remember everything, and make sure that what I'm doing on the Launchpad complements what's on the vector. And there's only a little bit of overlap, and those edit pages are one of those cases. But as I've seen Trovarsi play live, and let me get back to part 1. If I go to the user page on this Launchpad, this is where I select which part I want to edit. I go to edit part 1, and let me squeeze this back down to 8 steps. So Trovarsi, you've used this page to edit patterns live in a set, right?
Yes, like play it on the, yep.
Yeah, Trovarsi, you were doing that in your recent performance with Alex, I noticed.
Yeah.
At NobCon.
Yes. Like adding in notes, just kind of playing them in and taking them out.
Yeah, super cool.
And a nice trick for this is that you can edit your pitches here and say on the vector have the sequence control page open and change other settings, right? The way this works is that the top row of buttons selects the octave that you're programming in. The bottom 7 rows are the pitches, arranged as 7 steps in a diatonic scale for 1 octave, excluding the top note. So if we're in, I'm actually in E flat, but we'll say if I were in C, then the bottom row would be C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. And then to get to the C above that, you would go up to the next octave and program it on the bottom row. So if I was going to reprogram this as a scale, I would do it like that. And I can go up an octave and say, move a couple notes up. So if I program a note and I press it again, it moves it from the sequence. Right. So this is kind of an interesting way to almost, randomly explore a pattern. And then for drums, let's unmute our drums. select part 8. So my hats are here. I can clear those out and then adjust the level on that a little bit. Right, so you can very quickly manipulate a pattern. You get, so the drum parts have 4 voices or 4 lanes, I often say, and this is a 16-step pattern. And on the Launchpad, we show 4 voices, 16 steps all at once. So the top 2 rows are the bass drum. You can clear out the entire pattern. The next 2 rows are the snare drum. The 3rd row is hats. And the 4th row I'm using for something else I'll talk about a little later. So this is another easy way to very quickly sketch in a pattern, and then you can of course go back to the vector and edit the velocities manually. And the way this works, for those of you that haven't seen it before, is there's a cursor along the bottom, and for each step, there are 4 possible little bars you can bring up that represent hits, and the height of the bar is the velocity amount. And I'm using a Bitbox Micro, which is, I'm using over MIDI, and by default, it's velocity sensitive, which is handy. So I can also flip to, from the cursor mode to select mode and edit all those steps at once. So I'm on voice 3, which is the hats. I can bring those out completely. I can bring them in as a group. Of course, I can still grab encoders directly. Get a little bit louder hit on some of those. Similar for the bass drum, if I want kind of some very quiet phantom hits, I can dial those in.
Jim, there's a question, and also I just want to clarify. So MKB asks, can sessions be stored and recalled? So they're stored with the project. And then also just talk about just mention which Launchpad models is supported.
So we are going with the Mark III line, this is the Mini Mark III. There's also the Launchpad X and the Pro Mark III. So these are the ones that are currently in production. They have nice fast chips in them. Some of the older models have they're kind of slow to respond to MIDI. And they all have USB-C connections, which are really nice and snug. So those are the ones we've decided to support. The older ones, we ran into different problems. Some of them are a little sluggish to respond to MIDI updates. Some of them, the USB jacks have gotten to be a bit loose, and then you have trouble like just maintaining the connection. So I limited it to just the Mark III variety. And then in terms of saving things, when you hold down Shift and Save, you get a basically save dialog, and I always use numbers on the end of mine, so you can set the names. And I'm going to say this is now version 2, hit the next button to save that. I can hit Shift and load, and I can load an older project, or I can go back and let's see, there it is, LSDN2. Reload the project. It's not completely seamless, but once you kind of get used to things, you can do it fairly quickly. Some people prefer to have each song be a different project or session. Some people prefer for a live show to combine sessions into one file, which is a little bit of work, but means you can go the entire set without having to stop and start it all.
Very cool. Did that answer your question, MKB? Cool.
Yep, cool. And then just a couple more pages in the Launchpad before I forget about them. So we covered the session page, which is kind of your top level view and control with mutes and selects and things. And then what's labeled drums on this Launchpad is actually for presets. So I can queue up and trigger presets. There's preset quantization that can be set in the sequence control pages. In this case, it's bar. So it makes it easy to have things queue up on a bar line. And for me personally, if I'm doing a set, I tend to use this page on the Launchpad to control the arrangement as I'm moving through the project. Next over, we have keys, and there are this keyboard layout, which is in fourths. So every row is 1/4 or 5 semitones higher than the previous one. This is one layout option that's new in the new beta versions. And then the older version is a 4-octave, more traditional layout. So you can use this, as I did before, for arpeggios, or you can use this for playing live through things, or you can use this for step recording. Very handy. And then, of course, the last page is the edit pages that we talked about earlier.
Cool. So now that you went through the Launchpad connectivity, can we talk about like maybe some of the other connectivity in terms of connecting hardware and showing like how to change some of the bank and the presets and how it can follow how that works? I know
Right.
I know Stu and some others are interested in sending like preset changes.
Okay, so just to review the MIDI connection options, we have USB MIDI to host, which would be to say to a computer. You could use this then to have the vector sequence, some plugins in Ableton or Logic. USB-A I usually use for the Launchpad, but you could also plug in some other keyboard that has USB output. We have the 2 MIDI outputs here, and then 2 DIN MIDIs on the expander. And for working with MIDI gear, I usually use MIDI 2, I have mapped to the Bitbox. MIDI 1, I send through HX Stomp and then to a Roland MC101. And then occasionally I'll plug the USB-B port into the laptop for controlling plugins. There are 2 setting areas for working with program changes. There's program change in, which is in your globals. So I press the globals button and then go down to page 5. And when you turn these on, let's say I turn it on for the USB-B port, which would be from a computer, it'll receive program change messages. And the program change messages start with 0 and go up, and those trigger the matching presets. For channels 1 through 8, you're controlling the presets for that part, so the equivalent of this page. For channel 16, it's controlling the scenes, so you can use it to trigger scenes. And then a general tip for anybody who's doing that is to make sure that you're sending the program change a little bit before a bar line if you want the presets to change on the bar line. It takes a little bit of time. So if you're sending a program change exactly on a new bar, it'll be too late, and then your change will be a bar late. So this is for incoming program change, and this is a global setting. It affects the whole session. For sending program changes out, that's hidden in sequence control page. You dial down to the 3rd page, MIDI, and you can set, say, program change 8, and this is what I call a cue parameter. So as you edit it, it goes gray and you see the little Q icon, and then only when you push it does it become active. And this is so that you're not it also sends out the program change when you do that. So the idea is that you select the value and then queue it up, and then it gets sent. And then we have a timing option here for sending it normally and sending it early. And this is to avoid the issue I described with Ableton and the vector with, say, you're using the vector and the Digitact is, if you're sending it normally, the program change will happen when this preset is triggered. But if you're using a Digitact, it quantizes changes to the bar as well. So you want to say send early, and then it will send the program change a little early so that the Digitact will change on the bar line along with whatever's going on in the vector. And then you can also send bank changes. And because different synthesizers respond to bank changes differently, and there are they're actually CC messages, you get to choose which CC message you want to send for a bank change. And then in case you're wondering, these CCs are for per step CCs that you can send. They're hidden under the velocity page, and you can set CC values on the sequencer for CC1, and then I can go to the control page and set CC1 to be CC11. So then every time there is a step, a note that happens on those steps, it'll send those CC values.
Cool. Stu, did you have another specific question with regard to the Digitact?
No, that was it. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Happy to. Yeah. Yeah. So, we're definitely trying to do what we can to help the vector fit into a larger universe, right? And synchronization is definitely another area that, we've been iterating on and working hard on. If you have a vector in your system, there are two possible ways to clock it. You can clock it with something that is, say, what some people call beat clocks, which is a 16th note clock, which isn't that great for the vector because the vector runs at a much higher internal rate. And also the vector can easily generate 16th note beat clocks, and I'll cover how to do that. Another option is, and my PAMS has wandered off. Here it is. You can use, if you have a PAMS workout in your system, you can set this to generate a DenSync type clock where you have one output generates a run stop signal, another output generates a 24 PPQN clock. You can plug that into the run and clock jacks on the vector. And in globals, if you set the sync mode to RC24, then the vector will sync up with the PAMs very nice and tight. Chris and I have used that setup many times. Another option is you could use USB MIDI, and via the A or the B ports. MIDI clock sync is also a 24 PPQN style sync, and that works fairly well as long as you don't have a lot of traffic on the USB bus. In particular, is say you're running from here into a MIDI, into a USB hub with a keyboard and a printer and an audio interface, then the USB bandwidth is trying to balance between all these different things, and MIDI is usually the one that ends up getting slowed down the most. If you have something that generates DenSync, the DenSync input works really well. We've used that to sync vectors to each other. I've also used this to sync to a Roland SBX, and I think it's the ERM multi-clock is a master clock source people often use. Another option is if you use a DAW with silent way or any sort of audio to CV converter, you can generate a DenSync style signal and run it into the run and clock jacks. Our friend Steve Turner in Melbourne does that with Cubase and Motu interfaces in silent way and gets amazingly tight sync. If you're generating sync on the globals page, page 4, you can turn on MIDI sync for all of the MIDI output options. DenSync is always output here. For generating sync out of these jacks, it's on the routing pages, and I dialed down to where I have all the trigger options. and actually not that, the run, clock, and reset jacks. And by default, run is run. Clock is a 16th note clock, so Eurorack style beat clocks, and reset is set to go high on whole notes. I could change the clock independently to be a different rate, say 16th note triplets. I can also use any of the 8 trigger outputs to generate clock signals as well. And then also a nice little convenience is I've set trigger 1 to follow gate 1 on my primary sequence, so that I have 2 gate outputs for part 1. I use one to trigger an envelope for amplitude, another to trigger an envelope for filter cutoff. So I just don't have to use a Y cable. It's just handy in terms of configuring the system for travel. So that's synchronization in a nutshell, without any actual examples, but give you an idea. If you're working with a computer and the computer is your master clock, then you can use USB MIDI for sync. Or if you have Silent Way or any sort of a system like that with an ES9, you can use run and clock with a DIN style clock of 24 PPQN. Those both work really well. If you have a large modular system without a Pamela's or something that's kind of your main clock master, you could make the vector the clock master. Or if you have a PAMS, you can easily sync the vector to PAMS or vice versa. And I think that's it for sync.
Great. So I know you mentioned changing the triggers. That's a good segue to get into that.
Yeah. All right. So there's a fairly advanced little trick you can do. When I was talking about the sequence, let me turn sync back to internal. I'm going to mute the drums for now. Actually, no, I'm going to leave the drums running. Part 1 is this sequence here. And I'm running at a rate of 16th notes, musical divisions. I can change the mode to be something unusual. I can also change the mode to what I call external trigger mode. And in this case, I'm going to use T4, which allows you to use trigger 4 as an input to trigger this sequence. And I've got just a regular patch cable going from trigger 3 to trigger 4. And there are 2 settings on the sequence. I have to say that T4 is the trigger mode for this part. I go into globals and I go to the routing page and I configure trigger 4, the jack, to be an external input, EXT. I've also configured trigger 3 to be D8.4, which means drum part 8, voice 4. So that's coming out of trigger 3, and I could take trigger 3 and here we go, live patching in a demo. Let's turn that down. And I go to part 8. And I'm triggering the amplitude envelope for part 8 from the drum part. But the sequence isn't moving, so we're only getting one note. So and the sequence isn't moving also because I have it on T8 mode. And you can see no LEDs, nothing happening. I go to part 8, I'm sorry, go back to I have D8 part 4 going into trigger 4 input. I missed something. So that's part 4. So now I have the fourth voice, the fourth lane of my drums, stepping the sequence on part 1. I pull these hits out. The sequence is moving step by step, but it's only moving forward when it gets triggered by lane 4 on the drum part. So compositionally, this is an interesting way where you know what notes you want to play, but you're having trouble figuring out the exact rhythm you want. So you can set it to be triggered from a drum part, and you can just start playing around with choosing notes, choosing steps where you want to hear a note. And then another little trick is I can go to the sequence control page for part 1, and I've set the mode to be T4. It's triggered from trigger 4, but the rate is still 16th notes, which governs how long the step is. I can adjust the gate, but that only gets me so far. I can change the rate say a quarter note. And I get better control over the length of the note when I have more sparse pattern. I can go back to part 8. Turn on all the notes, go back to part 1. So the rate is basically a suggestion to this part that, oh, the triggers are going to come in at roughly a 16th note rate or an 8th note rate. And then Chris Meyer, I know, uses this trick a lot with the grids. So on the grids, you can generate patterns intuitively using a set of knobs, run that trigger into here, and use that to control pitch sequence on the vector. Or Trovarsi uses it with the Metron. So she can program in the rhythmic pattern on the Metron and have that control a pitch sequence on the vector. And Chris is nodding, so I guess I got that right. So, and then I think my last prepared demo is with chord mode, and that I have on part 5. I'm going to mute
before you jump in there, I just want to check in with everyone. Does anybody have any questions about anything that's been covered, or any other question before Christian? I saw you unmute yourself.
I got a few questions. I'm sorry I didn't bring them up as you were going over each topic. I was just taking everything in. The first question, I guess, is related to the playlist. So what I have often is like a eight-step pattern. And in my mind, I'm like, I want this one to play 3 times and then go to the next one. Mm-hmm. And I think you probably covered it, but we went over a lot. Being that it's basically, if I say, you know, play, since it's set to bar, I end up hearing it twice, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. So, how do I set it so, hey, I just play this one, even though it's an 8-step pattern, 3 times, and then go to the next one?
All right, so there are 2 things. Let me make sure I get the right setting here. So is it an 8-step pattern? Let's just say it's a 1-bar pattern. Is it a 1-bar pattern, or a 2-beat pattern, or longer or shorter, or?
It's, generally, like I don't change the length. So it's just by default on 8. I'll set up, 8 different notes. And I'm like, I'd like this series of 8 notes to play 3 times and then go to another sequence. Okay.
So going back to the example where we have that guy. So we have this pattern here and this other pattern, which is basically the same pattern transposed up a few semitones. from the preset page, I hit previous to get to the preset edit page. I can say part 5, play for 3 bars, and then go to part 6. Part 6, play for 1 bar, and then go back to part 5. And then go over and turn the playlist on. And so cue up part 5. It's going to play for 3 bars and then go to part 6. Now, part 5 is an 8-step pattern at 16th note, so it's actually only 2 beats long. Instead of setting this up in bars, I can set it up in beats. I can say play for 6 beats and then go to preset 6. And similarly with preset 6, I can say play for 2 beats and then go back to preset 5. And then I also want to go onto the sequence controls and change the preset quantization to beat, so it doesn't hold those preset changes until a bar line. And now when I run, so is that close to what you were looking for?
Yeah, I think that the key for me was switching it from anticipating a bar amount to beat amount before it makes the transition to the next part.
Correct.
Yeah, so that's very helpful. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Anything else? Any questions?
I got a few more. On the USB-A connection where you have the Launchpad, is it at all possible to use a powered hub so I could have like a keyboard and a Launchpad?
Unfortunately not. That is a limitation in the drivers, the USB drivers that come with the CPU. They don't support hubs.
Okay.
So the best option is to plug in the Launchpad here and use the MIDI input on the expander with a DIN MIDI connection.
And then per part, you can determine what it's kind of expecting, what it's looking at for transposition or for playing in notes?
Yeah. So on the record page, say part 1, we can set it to transpose. Part 2, we could set it to transpose as well, or it could be the ARP. And then you can set the source. So part 1, we can transpose from the vector keyboard, or let's say it was a MIDI input here, right? And then part 2, you can say arpeggiate from the Launchpad. And part 3, you could say, oh, I want to transpose this from the expander.
Fantastic.
And then this record setting is global, and it's also available on the Launchpad. Is the second button to the right of all the per part record modes. So I can turn global record on and off here, and then I can use the Launchpad to flip the individual modes on and off.
And it's cool because it has the different colors, so you know that they're right in the.
Yeah, it gives you at least some indication of what's going on, right? Transpose is purple and ARP is pink.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
One thing I'll do often is I'll come up with a part and then I'll duplicate it a bunch of times and then transpose the duplicated parts.
Mm-hmm.
If I do that enough times, I can't remember necessarily like how many semitones I transposed the duplication. Is it at all possible to visualize what it's done to your pitches? Because it'll show the same sequence and then you can go in and say, oh, I've transposed this up 4, but it doesn't actually show you the result of the transposition.
Look on the sequence control page, because when you transpose from a keyboard, it's just setting this parameter value.
Right.
Yeah. And so you could look at the transpose value for the different presets. And then, and this is a question that somebody's asked and I haven't figured out what to do yet, is should right now, if you transpose up, say 5 semitones, the pitch values don't change.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And, one of the things to consider, and I'm all ears if you have an opinion on this, is should this transposition change the pitches here that you see here? And I'm going to guess your answer is probably yes. And what I could do is have these changed to indicate what you've done on the transposition, but also have some sort of extra icon in here to show that that's because of a transposition.
A little asterisk, and it shows you the result of the transposition. That'd be so helpful.
Okay. All right. No, thanks for chiming in on that, because I've been looking for feedback on it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Chris, do you have an opinion on that front? Because I know you've done some of this stuff.
Yeah, I've been using crazy stuff like the external CV to do the transpositions, but I haven't played with transposing the vector more, and just watching your demos making me think I should try to do that more from external sources. Like, but in terms of displaying, yeah, it's got to be a temporary display update rather than permanently changing the underlying sequence, because I consider the transposition from the keyboard input to be like a performance thing rather than editing the sequence thing.
Right. Yeah, I've gotten feedback along both fronts, so it's my job to kind of think about it for a while and figure out what makes sense that'll work for both working styles.
Could you maybe do like a dual display with the shift function that you can say, this is the original sequence and this is what's actually playing with all transpositions included? Like also, the chance operations and stuff.
The chance operations, it would be difficult because I don't know what it is until they've operated. But there's one trick where it's called follow mode, and when follow is on, and let's say you have a 16-step sequence. Go back to the part 1. The sequence. The edit page follows the sequence, right? Which for a sequence like this can be kind of annoying. So instead of having to go in and change this preference, where is it? This preference, there's a shortcut. You hold down Q and press encoder 9. I think it's encoder 9. Yep. Nope. What did I do? I missed something. Anyway. But getting back to your point, the idea is that it could be that there is a preference in sequence control in the main preferences for always displaying the pitches as they are programmed in the sequence, or displaying the pitches as calculated with external and internal transpositions. And then there could be a hotkey somewhere for flipping between those two displays and some indication on the screen of which display you're looking at. And of course, I would add probably little badges between the steps to indicate that, like, oh, there's an octave transposition and there's a semitone transposition. And with external modulation, we already have a badge to say that there's external modulation on things.
With the chance operations, might it be possible in future firmware or something to have more than one per step?
That is a very, very frequent request. And it requires some significant internal juggling of how memory is handled, and definitely want to do that. I just can't say when yet it'll show up.
Okay.
Cool.
Oh, sorry. Last one. I've been wanting to ask all these. I'm sorry to hog up the time.
No. That's what we're here for.
Go for it.
Is there a option to set, if you make a new session, sort of your own defaults?
There isn't yet, but that is also a frequent request, is to have both template projects. So when you load it, you can't save over it. You have to do a save as. And also, as you say, a default project is, when you turn it on, this is what you get.
Right. Okay.
And just on that subject as well, something else that's in the queue that people are asking for is a way to copy presets between projects. Which we don't have yet. And for those of you who don't have a vector, you can copy presets within a project within a part and between parts in one project. So basically I hold down the edit button and I press select to select a preset. I can go and select a new preset, hold down edit and press skip to copy it in, or I can also hold edit and press a white key to copy that preset in directly. That latest option is a new trick in the latest beta. So yeah, that's an area that I'm kind of still actively filling in the areas is management of a project, right? Copying and pasting presets, inserting presets, that sort of thing.
That's handy. I like to use that to copy a preset and move them between the parts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, okay, let me,
Ian had one question. Go ahead.
sure.
Yeah, I was hoping you could show off that free gate mode.
Sure.
And I did have a question about that. Did the velocity, did they go with the free gate, or do they continue with the sequence?
Everything at velocity, everything else stays with the main sequence. I already have requests for free velocity and free ratchets and chants and all of it. And I said, okay, I thought like, okay, we'll just start with gate for now, and just kind of work out any usability kinks there, and see how people, if how do I describe how it works? How do people use it? What are any problems? And then later on, we can start to look at adding kind of the free running option for the other lanes, right? And then there's just, you run into weird questions like, okay, do I just add like 8 presets for 8 different, free velocity, free length, free ratchet, or is it some other way of managing that? But for those of you who don't know, free gate is a new option. And if I start with just drums and bring this back down to an 8-step sequence. If I turn off all the gates, the gates follow the sequence, right? They're tied to the main sequence. If I turn on the free gate option, which is page 3 of sequence controls, and I'm going to set it to 3, then the gate sequence, which you can see by the LEDs on the gate page, are only do 3 steps, and they're free running. They don't automatically reset on step 8. They basically just completely ignore where the rest of the sequence is in terms of what step. It's the same sequence rate, but only these 3 steps are used for the gate values. And I also added a trick. So if one of the steps is off, the display will animate to show you which steps are actually playing. And then I can go and I can set free gate to say 5. So this is a really easy way to get some polyrhythm action going for a pattern. Okay, next question.
Very cool. Adam, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I was actually just wondering, Jim, what your inspiration was for designing and building the Vector, and if there were any gaps in the market in particular that you were trying to fill with the Vector.
So this goes back like many years now, right? I got kind of obsessed with sequencing and electronic music because I can't play a keyboard well enough to play synthesizer lines. And of course, sequencers are a great way to have some backing tracks. And initially I went through, this was an early version of Reactor or Digital Performer of things. And I finally got fed up, and I was already a software developer. So I started writing in different software languages and finally ended up doing numerology. And then fast forward another 10 years after that, I'd had Eurorack modules for 20 years now, actually. I had some Dope for modules and some analog systems modules, which I still have, and had been using those back in the day with a MIDI CV interface, and again, either Digital Performer or something else. And then I can't remember the exact timeline, but 7 or 8 years ago, when Eurorack really started to explode, and I started to see, both analog and digital sequencers in Eurorack format, there was kind of this like, well, it's cool, but I would do it differently. And there are certainly a lot of things that I think I could do that would be better within a certain niche. And, my own personal take on Eurorack and sequencing is that there's the way that I like to do it. And I have kind of this, it's kind of the big all-inclusive sequencer, but I also totally respect the more distributed approach where you're using several smaller sequencers, and also support, and Chris does this a lot, where say you've got a grids that is a smaller sequencer, a very specific purpose sequencer in a way, and integrate that with the vector. But the way I actually got into this is a friend of mine introduced me to a guy who's an engineer, and he was interested in collaborating. And so we spent, I think it was about a year before I decided whether I could really do it. And then about 2 years of figuring out how to do it before we actually did our first public demo at NAMM. And, for me, I wanted a fairly deep sequencer that still had a fairly shallow UI. I wanted to pull a lot of things that I had in numerology into a hardware box. I knew I couldn't do all of them. So that was the interesting design challenge is, figuring out the details of the UI. I knew I wanted to use a display with encoders beneath it, but how to fit everything in a way that made it quick and easy to use. And it took a fair bit of learning in terms of moving from a desktop environment where you have essentially unlimited memory to a microcontroller where you have very limited memory. And so that was an interesting challenge. And now it's a very comfortable space to work in. And there's some very nice things like, no forced OS upgrades, right? So, for me, it was just like, I've been a sequencer guy for a long time now. And it's like, in terms of everything, a lot of things moving to hardware, it's like, okay, I have to do a hardware sequencer, and in terms of getting into Eurorack specifically, it was like, well, if I'm only going to do one module, it's going to be a sequencer, and I'm going to do it, for me to use. And I had lots of really good feedback from beta testers in terms of, what things worked and what things needed to change.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I think we have time for the demo.
Okay.
With regard to the chords,
All right. So I'm going to flip cameras real quick. And this here is a small case with a 2 oscillator AGH system. So I've got 2 oscillator modules, filter, envelopes, and I'm just using the small VCA here on the dual LFO. And I've got these cables running from the vector to control it, separate inputs for 1 volt per octave, and then the filter and VCA envelopes. And a trick that I've been doing a lot lately is, instead of running it from a monophonic patch, to run it from a chord part. So I have part 5 formatted as chords. And let me start this pattern up. I'm going to mute that one. Turn the drums off to start. So this is a chord part. Like drum parts, it has 4 voices or lanes. The primary lane is displayed as note names, just like a monophonic sequence. And then the other 3 lanes are just in semitones. And you can see the 7 is for 7 semitones up. And I can go in here and I can dial that down to say 0 or 5 or so forth, right? And I only have 2 oscillators to control, so there are only 2 note chords. I'm using CV outputs, pitch 3 and pitch 4 from the expander. And this allows me to tune the 2 oscillators independently. So if I dial this down to 0, now they're basically in unison. And as I dial this up, I can get different intervals. Of course, I can even say make this shorter. So I can actually do 2 note chords with this monosynth, paraphonic of course, but still very useful. faster sequence. Find it generally works better. Have them all on the same interval. And then dial them as a group. So that's my analog paraphonic chord trick I've been doing a lot lately, and it's a lot of fun. And of course, you can send chord parts out to MIDI, and that could be fairly interesting to use with 3 or 4 note chords on a bass ostinato on, say, an iridium. Or you can also split and say one note is one monophonic patch on a modular and another note is a different monophonic patch, and tie them together like that. Or you could layer the two together. So.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's a fun trick. I like that, since I can't afford a polyphonic mode. So.
Well, that was awesome. Does anybody have any more questions? Do you think? Ian, I've been watching your IG and know that you've been using the Launchpad as well. Is it working out for you okay?
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Yeah, the Launchpad and Vector is great. Especially the muting. When you have a drum part, being able to mute one drum is really great from the Launchpad, whereas on the Vector you can only mute the whole part. So yeah, it's a really great integration. Yeah,
that's something I still haven't figured out where to fit in the Vector UI, is muting individual lanes. And there's a temptation, because there are 8 white buttons here, to spread it across 2 parts, so you could mute and unmute across a couple parts, but that starts to get a little complicated. And so for now, we just have that on the Launchpad as a little Easter egg for Launchpad users, I guess. And but you're right, it really helps, particularly for performing, where you've got a higher level UI where you can see all your parts and what activity's going on, do mutes, switch presets.
Great.
Can I ask one last one?
Sure.
Go for it.
It's sort of a two-parter, but it's related to transposing from the Launchpad. Is there a quick way or a convenient way to set all parts to record on, except from USB-A transpose, or must you do that individually per part?
You have to set it up individually per part. But what I would say is send me an email describing the use case, and I'll think about it and see if there's some other option that would make sense. Something I'd like to add is the idea of zones. And that would be, say, if you have a large keyboard, you could split it up into 2 or 3 or 4 zones and have each zone do something differently when it's plugged into the Vector. Another data point to keep in mind is some people want transpose to be just not even in the record page, because they see it as a non-destructive action, and they want to stay out of the record page, which they see are rewriting the sequence. So I could eventually see, and again, this isn't saying I'm going to do this, right? This is just like me opening up to the process and how these things get added, is to collect different data points from different users. And slowly some sort of solution will emerge, or it may be the case it's like, well, there's no way to solve it for both situations and not make it too complicated. Right now there's enough going on in here, as you've seen, that anytime I add something, I really try and make sure that it is fitting well with what's already there, right? Is that we're not like creating yet another mode or a hidden page. That we're kind of expanding what's in there to work better in different situations. But I mean, for everybody really, is to, if you have a use case that you're getting stuck on, or you're interested in something, send me an email, jim@512.com, And I try to respond to all the emails. I then collect the notes in different areas, and they sometimes sit for a while, but I always go back through them and kind of think about them. And as we're working on new firmware updates, try to incorporate the things that have been percolating enough that it's like, okay, yeah, it's time to add this. But definitely in general, like making it so that it's a bit of a MIDI hub where you can use a controller to control your whole system, both for composition and performance, is an important goal.
Right. And then please correct me if I'm wrong, but with the record on and transposition, so I'll oftentimes be using it with playlists. So sequence is running, and then maybe after a certain amount of time, it's going to automatically switch. And I'm playing on the Launchpad, transposing the sequence. It records that movement, right? So like if I transpose some weird amount, and when it returns, it doesn't go back to how it was, right? It doesn't go back to being how I initially sequenced it. That would be an awesome option. I think, I don't even know how you would describe it, but like a momentary transpose or something, it returns back.
Yeah, I can see that now. I mean, the initial transpose operation is meant as basically just set this parameter, right? That's the most natural way to implement it. Mm-hmm. But if you have two presets in a playlist, it's not going to work really the way you expect it to. Mm-hmm. And I can't quite give you a solution for that off the top of my head. So again, send me an email, describe how you're using it. It's like, hey, in this situation, I want to be able to transpose things, and it's not quite the way I would like it to work.
Okay. Awesome.
Yep.
Or even like a global undo, like
cool.
Undo, Ian has one more question. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, I had it was touched briefly. So in the new ARP modes, I remember somebody saying that the lowest, you could set like the lowest note of the ARP to say one voice, where it would be only playing the lowest note. Is that possible, or is that just like talked about, or was that completely in my head?
For arpeggiated monophonic parts, to just play the first note or the lowest note?
Yeah, so I guess the thought is like, say I would play a chord on the MIDI input, and one voice would play that as an ARP.
Right.
But say I want like a bass part that would only
play the lowest note.
Lowest note.
Right. That's on my notes somewhere. Send me an email to remind me, please.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not quite sure what the setting would be. But I think it probably would make sense for it to be through. And so you hold down the chord, and if I ensure that through is low note priority, then the lowest note will come out as, your bass note. But that was a use case that I had intended to verify.
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. This is awesome. Just want to check in with everyone. Make sure, do you have anyone have any additional questions before we wrap it up? Or any comments or anything?
Thanks so much. That was
awesome.
awesome.
Thank you. About the production process, are you purely a one-person shop? Are there other people doing additional things? It seems like a lot of work.
Yeah, I've got 3 part-time employees. Josh is in the back right now, testing and calibrating a bunch of vectors. Cody is here now and then. Cody does assembly work as well as test and stuff. And actually, they're both mixed. Management's a whole new skill. Yeah. But yeah, so I have to do procurement, which is the last few months been an interesting challenge, but we're doing okay right now. And working with dealers and the development and so forth. So a fair bit of what I do on a daily basis is just trying to stay organized enough so that I can get into the code. And so that does mean that particularly new features can sometimes take a few weeks from here's the first version to here's like the version that really works. But it's not boring, and I I've learned to enjoy the challenge, and and I still really enjoy working on new stuff on the Vector. So I think we're going to see a lot more on it.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, then on that note, I'm going to stop the recording.